Eleanor Whitman pressed her father's letter flat against the table, her hands trembling so hard, the candle flame bent sideways. 23 years old, unmarried, and now sold. Not in those words, of course. Her father used words like arrangement and duty and future secured. But Eleanor knew the difference between a door held open and a door locked shut. She'd spent her whole life knowing it. If this story moves something in your chest, subscribe to our channel and follow Eleanor all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Eleanor would later think was a cruel kind of joke. Tuesday being the most ordinary day of the week, the kind of day nothing was supposed to happen. Her father, Harold Whitman, had not come downstairs to deliver it himself. He'd had Thomas the houseman slide it under her bedroom door just after breakfast, as though it were a bill from the tailor or a note from a neighbor about a borrowed gardening fork. As though it were nothing. As though her life being redirected at 23 years old was simply an administrative matter to be handled before lunch. Eleanor read it, standing up still in her morning dress, her coffee going cold on the windowsill. The arrangement has been confirmed. Duke Alexander Fairchild of Philadelphia will arrive in Boston by the end of the month. You will be introduced at the Alderman's dinner on the 15th. I expect your cooperation in this matter. There is no room for argument. H. Whitman. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the edge of her writing desk and walked to the window and stood there for a long time, watching the street below. Boston in July was loud and golden. Vendors called out from their carts. Children chased each other between the wheels of slow-moving carriages. A woman in a pale blue dress stopped to buy something from a flower seller, laughing at something the old man said, tilting her head back perfectly free. Eleanor pressed one hand flat to the glass and felt the heat of the summer morning come through it. There is no room for argument. She'd known this was coming. Not in the sharp, specific way of knowing a date, but in the slow, coastal way of knowing a storm, feeling it in the air, long before the clouds appear. Her older brother Charles had married well 2 years ago. Her younger sister Clara was 16 and too young yet, which left Eleanor 23, unmarried, with a quiet stubbornness her mother had called spirit and her father had always called something else. She had refused 2 proposals already. Her father had allowed it barely. The first man had been 54 and smelled of camphor. The second had been pleasant enough, but had laughed at things that weren't funny and dismissed things that were. Eleanor had said no to both and felt nothing but relief, and her father had gone red-faced and silent, and the matter had been dropped. But that was before the debts. She didn't know the full amount. She only knew what she'd overheard fragments late at night through the study door, numbers that made her stomach turn. Her father's voice low and strained, a sound she'd never heard from him before, a sound like something structural giving way. And then, weeks later, a new name appearing at the dinner table in conversation: Fairchild. Philadelphia. Quite a substantial man. Quite well positioned. And now a letter under her bedroom door on a Tuesday. Eleanor picked up her coffee, found it cold, drank it anyway. She did not go to her father that morning. There was no point. She knew the conversation she would have, and she didn't have the energy for it yet. Instead, she took her shawl and her small canvas bag, and she walked out the front door of the Whitman house on Beacon Hill, and went down into the city, the way she always did when she needed to think, which was often, and which her father had never managed to entirely stop, despite years of trying. She walked fast. It was a habit she'd developed young, this particular pace, not quite running, but close, purposeful enough that strangers didn't stop to speak to her, which was the point. She moved down the slope of the hill and into the maze of narrow streets below, past the rooming houses and the printing offices and the taverns that were just now opening their shutters to the morning air. Clara caught up to her 2 blocks from home. "You saw it," Clara said, not a question falling into step beside her. Clara was 16 and had their mother's dark eyes and an uncanny ability to appear exactly where she wasn't supposed to be. "I saw it," Eleanor said. "Are you angry?" "I'm walking." "That's the same thing for you." Clara matched her pace easily. Who is he? Do you know anything about him? His name is Fairchild. He's from Philadelphia. Father seems to think he's impressive. Father thinks anyone with a full coat and a functioning estate is impressive. Eleanor almost smiled at that. Almost. He's a duke. Or the American kind, landed titled through colonial grant, the sort of man who gets called Your Grace at formal dinners by people who want something from him. And what does he want from us? Eleanor didn't answer that immediately. The truth was, she wasn't sure. Men like that men with money and position didn't generally need to look to the Whitmans of Boston for anything practical. Which meant either her father's debts were worse than she'd understood and someone had called them in, or there was something else at play entirely. Something she didn't have enough information to name yet. I don't know, she said finally, but I intend to. It was Clara who nearly died. Eleanor would remember that detail for the rest of her life, the particular geometry of it. How Clara had stepped just slightly ahead of her to look into the window of Aldrich's apothecary, laughing about something, reaching back to grab Eleanor's sleeve, and then in one lurching second, the world rearranged itself. The horse came out of the side alley at a full panicked run, no rider, the carriage behind it fishtailing and sparking against the cobblestones, the driver shouting and hauling at lines that had gone slack and wrong. Clara turned toward the sound and went entirely still, the way animals do when they're caught in the open, and there's no time to think, only to freeze. Eleanor lunged for her. She got one hand on Clara's arm and pulled hard, but she was at the wrong angle, and they both stumbled, and the carriage wheel was close, too close, the sound of it enormous. And then someone moved between them and the carriage, like a door swinging shut. He was tall. That was the first thing she understood, because he was simply there, suddenly occupying the space where the danger had been. His arm extended to stop the horse's shoulder and redirect its trajectory with a combination of force and steadiness that made no sense given how large and fast the animal was. He didn't yell, didn't scramble. He planted his boots on the cobblestones and held, and the horse slowed and turned, and the carriage rattled past with 6 inches to spare. Clara grabbed Eleanor's wrist so hard it bruised. The street noise returned all at once, shouting from the driver, passers-by, pulling back, someone calling, "Whoa, whoa," in a high, frightened voice. But Eleanor was looking at the man. He turned around. He was somewhere near 30, dark-haired, in traveling clothes that were good quality, but road-worn dust on his boots and his coat lapel. He had a way of standing that was particular, like he was accustomed to outdoor spaces, to having room around him, a Western kind of stillness. He looked at Clara first to check she was upright, then at Eleanor. His eyes were very blue. "You ladies all right?" His voice was low and unhurried, a southern tilt to it, the kind of voice that didn't rise at the end of questions. "Yes," Clara said breathlessly. "Yes, we are. Thank you, we—" She pressed a hand to her chest. "Goodness. Glad you're standing." He glanced at the retreating carriage back at them. He touched the brim of his hat in that brief, particular way men did when they meant to move on. "Watch these side streets, ma'am. Drivers don't always check before they—" "You stepped in front of a runaway horse," Eleanor said. He looked at her. There was a beat of quiet. "I did," he said. "Why?" Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. Seemed like the thing to do. Eleanor looked at him steadily. She was aware that her heart was still going too fast, and that her voice had come out flatter and more direct than was socially appropriate for a woman who'd just been rescued, and she found she didn't care. "You could have been hurt. Could have." He kept looking at her with a kind of frank attention she wasn't accustomed to. Not the studied assessments of drawing-room men, but something plainer. Wasn't, though. Another touch to his hat. "Have a good morning, ladies." He turned to go. "Wait," Clara said before Eleanor could think about whether to stop him. "At least what is your name, so we can thank you properly?" He paused, turned back halfway. "Alexander," he said, "just passing through." "We're the Whitman sisters," Clara offered. "Eleanor and Rose," Eleanor said. Clara turned to stare at her. Eleanor kept her eyes on the man called Alexander and kept her voice perfectly steady. "I'm Rose. Clara's the social one, as you can probably tell." There was a moment. The man looked at her with those blue eyes, and she looked back, and something in the morning air went very still. "Rose," he repeated, not questioning it, just saying it like he was setting it down somewhere. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, and then he was walking away down the street, and Clara grabbed Eleanor's arm so hard she nearly stumbled again. "What on earth?" Clara hissed. "Was that?" "I don't know," Eleanor said quietly. But she watched him until he turned the corner. She told herself it didn't matter. By the time they got home, Clara had invented 3 separate explanations for Eleanor's behavior, each more dramatic than the last, and Eleanor had refused to confirm or deny any of them. They came in through the kitchen door, which was Clara's preferred entrance, when she wanted to avoid their father, and Eleanor went straight upstairs and stood in the middle of her bedroom and breathed, "Rose." She didn't know why she'd said it. Only that when Clara had started to speak her real name, something had seized in her chest a kind of wild refusal, the same refusal she'd felt reading her father's letter that morning, the same refusal she'd been carrying quietly for years. Eleanor Whitman was the name on the arrangement. Eleanor Whitman was the name her father had signed away in a letter to a duke in Philadelphia. Eleanor Whitman was the name with no room for argument. Rose was nobody. Rose was a woman on a summer street in Boston who owed nothing to anyone. She sat down at her desk and did not write anything for a long time. Supper that evening was the particular kind of formal that meant her father was in a controlled mood, which was somehow worse than when he wasn't. Harold Whitman sat at the head of the table and carved the roast with precise, contained movements and asked Clara about her morning and did not look at Eleanor directly. Eleanor waited. He let her wait through the first course and halfway through the second before he set down his fork and looked at her. "You received my letter." "I did. And I'd like to know more about the arrangement before the 15th. Harold studied her with the expression he used when he was deciding how much patience to spend. He was a large man, gone a little soft at the edges, with Eleanor's same stubborn jaw and her mother's coloring, which Eleanor had always found vaguely unfair. "What precisely do you need to know?" "Everything." She kept her voice even. "Who he is, what he wants, what you've promised him." Something flickered behind her father's eyes. "I've promised nothing beyond what's standard." "Standard," she repeated. "You've promised him a wife." "I've proposed an arrangement beneficial to both families." "And what does our family receive from this arrangement?" The silence at the table went tight. Clara looked at her plate. Thomas, standing near the sideboard, found something requiring his attention in the middle distance. Harold said slowly, "Stability. Security. The continuation of—" "How much?" Eleanor said. Her father put his fork down. "How much debt?" she said. "That's what I'm asking. Because a man like Fairchild, a duke from Philadelphia, who doesn't know us, who has no reason to look toward Boston for a wife, doesn't offer an arrangement like this without something specific in return. And whatever that something is, I'd like to know what I'm walking into." The silence stretched out long enough that she heard the candle nearest to her father hiss as it flickered. 40,000, Harold said, finally, very quietly. Eleanor felt the number land somewhere behind her sternum. She didn't let it show on her face. "Fairchild has agreed to assume the debt," her father continued, quietly, "in exchange for—" He stopped. "In exchange for me." Harold's jaw tightened. "In exchange for the joining of our families." "Eleanor, this is not—" "I'm not arguing," she said, which was not entirely true, but she needed him to keep talking. "I just want to understand." Her father looked at her for a long moment. Something behind his eyes was tired in a way she'd rarely seen from him, a bone-deep tiredness that was almost humanizing. "He's a good man," Harold said. "From everything I've been told, he's not unkind. He picked up his fork again, looked at it, set it down. "He's agreed not to press the timetable. You'll have the dinner on the 15th to meet him properly. If there are genuine and reasonable objections after that, they can be discussed." "Reasonable," Eleanor said. "Don't, Eleanor." She didn't. She picked up her own fork and finished her supper and said nothing else, and after dinner she went upstairs and sat at her window and looked out at the city in the dark. $40,000. Her whole life weighed and settled like an outstanding account. Somewhere out there, in whatever inn or boarding house or private estate, he'd arrived at a man named Alexander Fairchild was presumably eating his own supper, probably not thinking about her at all. And somewhere inside Eleanor Whitman, a woman named Rose was sitting very quietly waiting. She went back to the Apothecary Street the next morning. She told herself she needed thread. She went to the dry goods shop first, bought thread she didn't need, and then stood on the cobblestones for a moment in the early light and watched the street. She was not waiting for anyone. She was simply standing. In the summer morning, with the heat already building and the vendors setting out their wares and the city doing what cities do. "You're back," said a voice. She turned. He was across the street, leaning against the doorpost of the boarding house on the corner, a coffee cup in one hand, and his hat tipped back on his head the way men did when they were relaxed and not performing anything for anyone. "Alexander, just passing through." "I needed thread," Eleanor said. He looked at the small package in her hand. "Did you find some?" "I did," he nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that same direct, assessing calm from yesterday. Not rude, not searching in the uncomfortable way of drawing-room men. Just looking, like he was trying to understand something and was in no particular hurry about it. "You lied about your name," he said. Eleanor felt her chin come up slightly. "I offered an alternate name." "That's a polite way to put it." "I'm a polite person." The corner of his mouth moved. "Are you? On my better days." She shifted the thread package in her hands. "You said you were passing through. Are you still?" "Resting a few days. I have a—" He paused, something crossing his expression that she couldn't read. "Business to attend to in the city." "What kind of business?" He looked at her. "The kind that needs attending." "Helpful," she said dryly. This time he did smile, brief and real, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less like a man carrying something heavy. "Fairchild," he said. She went very still. He kept his eyes on her face. "My name's not just Alexander," I should have said. The morning air pressed around her, warm and close, smelling of bread from the baker down the block, and horses, and the river somewhere below. Eleanor did not move, did not let anything happen in her expression that she hadn't chosen. "Fairchild," she said carefully. "Alexander Fairchild." He watched her. "From Philadelphia." The thread package crinkled under her hands as her grip tightened once, and then she released it deliberately. Alexander Fairchild, Duke of Philadelphia, her father's creditor, her arranged husband, the man who'd stepped in front of a runaway horse to save a stranger's sister, the man who didn't know her name. "Pleased to meet you," Eleanor said, and her voice came out steady as a stone wall. "Mr. Fairchild." Something moved in his eyes. "You already knew." "No," she said. Which was the truth. "I didn't." She looked at him. This man she was going to marry, this stranger standing in a boarding house doorway with a coffee cup and road dust on his boots, and no idea at all that the woman he was looking at was Eleanor Whitman. "Did you know who I was yesterday?" "No." Quiet. "Certain." "I didn't know anyone. Just saw two women and a horse going the wrong direction." She looked at him for a long moment. "My name is Rose," she said. He looked back at her. "I know what you told me." "That's what I'm telling you now. In this street, in this city, I'm Rose. Not—" She stopped, breathed. "Whatever you know about the arrangement, whatever my father has told you, that woman exists somewhere else. But right now, in this moment, I'm Rose. And I'd like to know if you'd be willing to have a conversation with Rose before you meet the other one." The street went on around them, ordinary, and indifferent. Alexander Fairchild looked at her for a long, measured time. Then he drank the last of his coffee, set the cup on the boarding house step, pulled his hat forward on his head. "I reckon," he said slowly, "I could do that." Eleanor exhaled. "Good," she said. "Then let's walk." They walked north along the riverfront, where the morning crowd was thick enough that no one paid particular attention to a woman and a man moving side by side at a measured pace. Eleanor kept half a step of distance between them, close enough to be conversational, far enough to be proper, and said nothing for the first block, and neither did he. She was the one who broke it. "Why Boston?" she asked. "If you're from Philadelphia, why come here yourself? Men in your position send lawyers for arrangements like this." Alexander walked with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes forward. "I don't like lawyers doing things I can do myself." That sounds like something a man says when he doesn't trust people. Or when he values accuracy. He glanced at her sideways. "You ask direct questions for a woman who lied about her name. I ask direct questions because no one else will." She kept her pace steady. "My father sent me a letter, one paragraph. 40 years of his financial recklessness, summed up in 4 sentences and a signature. Nobody told me anything. They just arranged things, and expected me to appear at a dinner on the 15th and be agreeable." "And are you agreeable?" "Rarely," she said. "But I'm capable of it when the situation merits." Something about the way he carried himself shifted slightly, not quite relaxing, but settling like a man who'd been braced for something that hadn't come. "What do you want to know?" "Everything you're willing to tell me that my father didn't." He was quiet for a moment. They passed a group of dock workers moving crates loud and indifferent, and the noise covered the silence between them until it passed. "I knew your father had debts," he said finally. "My solicitor identified the Whitman estate as a possible investment. That's the word they used, investment." He said the word flatly, without inflection. "I reviewed the terms. I reviewed the family. I agreed to come to Boston." "Did you review me?" "I received a description." Eleanor felt something cold move through her chest. "What kind of description?" "The kind a father writes when he's trying to sell something." He said it without cruelty, but without softening it either. 23. Educated. Accomplished. Suitable temperament. "Suitable temperament," she repeated. "He said that." "He did." "I've been told my temperament is many things." Suitable was not generally among them. Alexander made a sound that was almost a laugh, low and brief, quickly controlled. "No. I'm beginning to see that." Eleanor stopped walking. He took 2 more steps before he realized it and turned back, and she looked at him directly in the full summer light with everything she was thinking right there on her face, because she was tired. She was so tired of performing composure for men who would arrange her life regardless. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically, not the way men answer women when they're trying to manage them. Honestly." He held her gaze, nodded once. "Is this arrangement something you want," she said, "or something you agreed to because it was convenient and your lawyers told you it was practical?" The question hung between them in the warm morning air. He didn't answer immediately, which she respected more than she would have respected a fast answer. He looked at her, and she could see him actually thinking, not performing thought, but doing it, working through something real. "I'm 31 years old," he said at last. "I have an estate in Philadelphia that runs well, and a seat on the county board, and more money than I need, and no one waiting for me when I come home at night." He paused. "That last part, I didn't used to mind it. Lately I do." He held her gaze. "So no. It's not purely convenient. But I'll be honest with you. I came to Boston expecting a drawing room introduction, and a woman who'd been coached to be pleasant. I did not expect—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "You," he said, plain as that. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest did something she didn't entirely sanction. "My name is Eleanor," she said quietly. "Eleanor Whitman. You should know that. Whatever else I told you." "I know," he said. "You knew yesterday. I suspected. A pause. The sister called you started to, and you cut her off fast enough that I thought either you're hiding from someone or you wanted to be someone else for a minute. Both, Eleanor said before she could stop herself. He looked at her steadily. Yeah, he said. I figured. They walked for another hour. She didn't plan to. It simply kept happening, one more block, one more question, one more answer that led to another question, and the city moved around them the way cities do when you're not paying attention to them. She learned he had grown up in Western Virginia before his family's land grants were formalized into something that warranted the Fairchild name being said with gravity. He had a younger brother who managed half the estate and a temper that didn't show unless something mattered enough. He had been engaged once before briefly 5 years ago, a woman in Savannah who had decided correctly that she didn't want to spend her life in Philadelphia. Were you devastated? Eleanor asked. I was relieved, he said, which probably tells you something about how that engagement came about. She thought about her father's letter. There is no room for argument. Yes, she said, it does. He learned she read everything she could get her hands on, which her father considered excessive, and her mother had considered admirable. She had managed the household accounts since she was 19, because her father's bookkeeper had retired, and her father hadn't found a replacement, and Eleanor had simply started doing it because someone had to, and she had a facility for numbers that she'd never been encouraged to develop. She had refused 2 proposals. She was not sorry about either. 2, Alexander said. 2. And you're telling me this why? Because you should know. She said that I'm not someone who says yes because it's easier. If I agree to this arrangement, if I appear at that dinner on the 15th, and I don't make my father's life impossible, it won't be because I was managed into it. She looked at him. It'll be because I chose it, and that requires knowing what I'm choosing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what else do you need to know? She almost smiled. Quite a lot, Mr. Fairchild. Alexander, he said, if we're whatever this is. Rose. She returned immediately, and then caught herself, and the almost smile made it the rest of the way. He tilted his hat brim at her, that same brief particular gesture from the day before, and something in Eleanor's chest did it again, that unauthorized thing, and she looked away at the river. She did not tell Clara. That was the first mistake, probably, though it didn't feel like one at the time. Clara noticed, of course, because Clara noticed everything the way 16-year-olds with nothing to occupy them do. She appeared in Eleanor's bedroom doorway that evening while Eleanor was sitting at her desk, not writing the letter to her father she'd been not writing for an hour. You went back to that street, Clara said. I went to buy thread. You already bought thread. I needed more. Clara came in without being invited, which was also usual, and sat on the edge of Eleanor's bed, and pulled her knees up and looked at her with the expression she used when she was done pretending to be patient. Eleanor, did you see him again? Eleanor set her pen down. Who? The man. The horseman. Alexander. The name landed differently in Clara's mouth than it did in Eleanor's head, and Eleanor felt a sharp warning go through her before she could stop it. She picked up her pen again. I ran into him, yes. He's staying at the boarding house on Court Street. And we spoke briefly. For how long? Clara. How long, Eleanor? A pause. An hour, approximately. Clara made a sound that could only be described as delighted devastation. She dropped her face into her hands. Oh, Eleanor. It was a conversation. 2 adults talking. There's nothing. He's very handsome. That's irrelevant. Is it, though? Clara looked up. Her eyes were bright and sharp and irritatingly kind. Because you came home and you've been sitting at that desk for an hour not doing anything, and you have a look on your face that I've never seen before, and I just want to understand what is... He's Alexander Fairchild, Eleanor said. Clara went very still. The name settled in the room like a stone dropped in still water. The Duke, Clara said quietly. From Philadelphia. Yes. The man father? Yes. Clara stared at her. He's the one who saved me. Yesterday with the horse. That was him. Yes. And he doesn't know who you are. Eleanor looked at her pen. He knows my name now. I told him. But he knew me first as Rose. And I... She stopped. Started again. I asked him to keep those separate. For a while. The arrangement and the rest. The rest? Clara repeated carefully. The conversation. The person. Eleanor set the pen down again, this time with finality. I needed to know who he was before I knew what he wanted from me. Those are two different things, and they had to stay different or I'd never... She stopped again. The words weren't coming out right. They made sense in her chest, but went sideways on the way out. I can't agree to something I don't understand. I won't. Not even for Father's $40,000. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she got up from the bed, crossed the room, and put both arms around Eleanor from behind her chin on Eleanor's shoulder, the way she'd done when she was small and Eleanor was the one who made sense of frightening things. Is he kind? Clara asked softly. Eleanor thought about a man stepping in front of a runaway horse for strangers. She thought about, I did. Seemed like the thing to do. She thought about the way he'd said both when she'd told him she understood his relief about the ended engagement, not filling the silence with reassurance, just letting the understanding sit between them. I think so, she said. Yes, then be careful, Clara said. Not because he's dangerous, because you are Eleanor when you care about something. You go all the way in and you don't look sideways. Eleanor didn't answer, but she reached up and put her hand over Clara's. So, she met him again Thursday. He'd asked before they parted Tuesday whether Rose walked on Thursdays. She'd said sometimes. He'd said he'd be near the Apothecary Street at 8 in the morning in case she happened to be. She happened to be. He was already there when she arrived, hat in hand, talking to a vendor selling early summer peaches, and he handed her one before she could say good morning, and she took it without thinking. And the normalcy of it. The impossible, ridiculous normalcy of a man handing her a peach on a street corner made something behind her ribs pull tight. I looked into your father's accounts, he said as they started walking. She stopped. You what? Not I didn't do anything improper. My solicitor confirmed the amount of the debt and the timeline of the pressure. I wanted to understand the full picture. He met her eyes. I'm not trying to use it against you. I wanted you to know I know, so you don't have to pretend the stakes aren't what they are. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Part of her was furious, the part that understood that information was power, and that men who had it were not always kind with it. But another part of her, the part that had spent 2 days measuring this man by his actions rather than his position, felt something else. And, she said, and the timeline is the pressure will come to a head in about 6 weeks. Which means the dinner on the 15th isn't optional for your father. He paused. It may still be optional for you, if you wanted it to be. Eleanor stared at him. What does that mean? It means I'm not going to force a woman to stand across from me at an altar because her father made poor investments. He held her gaze, steady and plain. If you meet me at that dinner, and you look at me, and you know with certainty that this isn't something you can agree to tell me. And I'll find another way to settle the debt. It'll take longer, and it'll be less clean, but why would you do that? She said, and the question came out raw, without the composure she'd been maintaining because this was not the conversation she'd expected, and she didn't have a prepared response for it. Because I've been arranged around before, he said quietly. And I know what it feels like to have your life treated like a ledger entry. I don't want to be the man who does that to someone else. Eleanor looked at him. The peach in her hand was warm from the sun. Down the street, someone dropped something metal that clattered loud against the cobblestones, and a horse snorted, and the city went on completely indifferent to the fact that Eleanor Whitman's understanding of what was possible had just shifted 3 inches to the left of where it had been. My father can't know we've spoken, she said carefully. If he finds out I met you before the 15th, before the official introduction. I know. He nodded once. I haven't said anything to him, My solicitor thinks I'm touring the city. And are you? That brief, almost smile again. I'm having a conversation with a woman named Rose. Eleanor breathed. You realize, she said, that you're making this considerably more complicated. I realize that, yes. And you're doing it anyway. I reckon, he said quietly, some things are worth the complication. She looked away from him at the river, at the light moving on the water, at the city going on and on around them, indifferent and ordinary, and full of people who weren't standing on a precipice between one version of their life and another. I'll be at the dinner, she said, on the 15th. He waited. But I'm going as Eleanor, she said, not Rose. Eleanor Whitman Harold's daughter, the suitable temperament one. She looked back at him. And when you meet her, you treat her like a stranger, because everyone else at that table will be watching. Something crossed his face, complicated, careful, and then resolved. Understood. And when it's over, she stopped. When it's over, he said. She looked at him for a long, deciding moment. We'll see, she said, whether Eleanor and Rose turn out to be the same person after all. He was quiet for a beat. Then he touched the brim of his hat, slow and deliberate, more formal than usual, like a man making a promise out of a gesture. I'll look forward to meeting her, he said. Eleanor turned and walked home before he could see what that did to her face. But she was almost certain from the way the silence behind her felt that he already knew. The dinner was 4 days away. She had 4 days to build the wall back up, to put Eleanor firmly in the place where Rose had been sitting, to remember that sentiment was a luxury, and $40,000 was a real number attached to real consequences for real people she loved. She had 4 days. She spent 3 of them walking the city every morning at 8 o'clock, and he was always there, and they never once talked about the arrangement or the debt or the 15th. They talked about everything else. Books and land management, and what it meant to run a household well versus running one impressively. Whether Boston's harbor was better than Philadelphia's. Whether her instinct about the accounts ledger had saved her father's estate from worse trouble 3 years ago, which she suspected it had, and which he confirmed with the calm certainty of someone who understood numbers. He told her about Virginia in autumn, the color of the hills, the particular silence of early morning, before the work began. She told him about her mother, who had died when Clara was 3, who had called Eleanor's stubbornness spirit, who had told her once that the most important thing a woman could know was the difference between what she was told she wanted and what she actually wanted. She sounds, Alexander said, like someone I would have liked. Everyone liked her, Eleanor said. She was the kind of person who made a room feel larger. You have that, he said. A little. You just carry it differently. Eleanor looked at him. Differently how? She made rooms feel larger. You make them feel more honest. He said it plainly, without ornamentation. People around you stop pretending to be things they're not. I've noticed, even with your sister. Even... He stopped. Even with you, she said. He met her eyes. Especially with me. The morning of the 14th, the morning before the dinner, Eleanor came to the corner of the Apothecary Street, and he was already there. And before she could say anything, he said very quietly, I want you to know, however tomorrow goes, whatever you decide, I meant what I said last Tuesday. You have a choice here. You've always had it, regardless of what your father put in that letter. Eleanor stood in the warm morning light and looked at this man she had known for 6 days. This man who had stepped in front of a horse and asked her nothing in return. Who had looked into her father's accounts, not to leverage them, but to free her from their weight. Who had met her every morning and talked to her like she was a person with a full interior life and not a practical solution to an inconvenient problem. I know, she said. Eleanor, I know, she said again softer. And I've made my decision. He went very still. I'll be there tomorrow, she said. And I'll walk into that dining room as Eleanor Whitman, and I will be correct, appropriate. Everything a Whitman daughter is supposed to be in public. She held his gaze. And in 3 or 4 hours, when the dessert is cleared and the men are drinking brandy and everyone is performing who they're supposed to be, look for the woman sitting nearest the window, because that one will be me, the real one." Alexander Fairchild looked at her for a long, full moment. "I'll look for her," he said. "I've been looking for her since Tuesday." Eleanor walked away. She did not look back, but this time she was smiling. She dressed carefully on the evening of the 15th. Not beautifully carefully. There was a difference, and Eleanor knew it. Beautiful was for women who wanted to be looked at. Careful was for women who wanted to be underestimated just enough to retain some control over the room. She chose the dark green dress, the one with the high collar, and the simple cut that her aunt had called severe and her mother would have called strategic. She put her hair up without ornamentation. She wore her mother's small pearl earrings, which were the only pieces of jewelry she'd ever worn, because they'd belonged to someone real. Clara appeared in the doorway while Eleanor was fastening the second earring, and watched her with the expression of someone witnessing something they weren't sure was brave or foolish. "You look like you're going to a negotiation," Clara said. "I am," Eleanor said. "Most women try to look. I'm not most women." She turned from the mirror. "How do I look?" Clara studied her honestly, the way only a younger sister can. "Like someone who knows exactly what she's walking into and has decided to walk in anyway." She paused. "Which is either very good or very dangerous." "Hopefully both," Eleanor said, and went downstairs. The alderman's dinner was held at the Prescott House on Commonwealth Avenue, which was the kind of house that announced its own importance before you walked through the door. 40 guests, maybe more. The cream of Boston society, arranged around long tables with silver that caught the candlelight, and conversations that were half performance and half intelligence gathering, the way all gatherings of powerful people are. Eleanor's father met her at the carriage door and took her arm, and she felt the tightness in his grip, not affectionate, not reassuring, urgent. The grip of a man who needed something to go right. "He's already inside," Harold said quietly. "With the alderman and Commissioner Hale. He's—" A pause. "He presents well, Eleanor. I need you to. I know, Father. Your temperament, Father." She stopped walking, which forced him to stop. She looked at him directly in the lamplight outside the Prescott house. "I will be everything you need me to be tonight. But I need you to understand I'm doing this for our family. For Clara. Not because I had no choice." Harold Whitman looked at his eldest daughter for a moment, and something in his face shifted, not quite remorse, but adjacent to it, a brief acknowledgement of something he didn't have the vocabulary to say. "I know," he said quietly. "Eleanor, Later," she said, and took his arm properly and walked through the door. She found him with her eyes before she was halfway across the room. He was standing near the window with the alderman and 2 other men she half recognized from Boston civic circles, his hat off and his coat straight, listening to something Commissioner Hale was saying with that particular attentive stillness she'd come to recognize over 6 mornings. He looked different in evening clothes, not uncomfortable exactly, but contained like a man who was accustomed to fitting himself into formal spaces without quite belonging to them. He had not looked up yet. Eleanor moved with her father toward the cluster of people near the fireplace and accepted a glass of punch from a passing servant and made the appropriate conversation with Mrs. Alderman Prescott, and smiled at the right moments and said the right things and kept the window in her peripheral vision the entire time. She saw the exact moment he registered she'd arrived. He didn't move, didn't turn. But something in his posture changed, a slight adjustment, like a man whose attention had just been pulled in a direction he was carefully not looking. Commissioner Hale said something, and Alexander responded, and his eyes stayed forward, and Eleanor took a slow breath and turned back to Mrs. Prescott and answered a question about the summer heat. The formal introduction came 20 minutes later. Her father materialized at her elbow with the specific gravity of a man executing a plan and said, "Eleanor, there's someone I'd like you to meet." And she turned, and there he was, and for one terrible second she forgot every instruction she'd given herself. He was looking at her with his face perfectly composed, and his eyes doing that thing they did, that plain direct seeing thing, and she could feel him not recognizing her and recognizing her simultaneously. The private double awareness of a man meeting Eleanor Whitman for the first time, while already knowing Rose. "Miss Whitman," he said, and his voice was exactly as it always was, even and unhurried. "I've heard a great deal about your family from your father. It's a pleasure." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Fairchild," Eleanor said, and her voice came out perfect. Correct. Suitable temperament. Every inch the well-managed daughter. She watched something flicker in his eyes, appreciation, she thought, for the performance, for the fact that she was doing it. "Your father tells me you manage the household accounts," Alexander said. Commissioner Hale made a sound of polite surprise. "Does she unusual arrangement?" "It is," Eleanor said pleasantly. "But someone has to, and I have a facility for numbers." She looked at Alexander. "Do you manage your own accounts, Mr. Fairchild? Or do you leave it to a solicitor?" "Both," he said. "I find solicitors are useful for the parts I don't want to think about, but the parts that matter, I prefer to understand myself." She sipped her punch. "That's a sensible approach." Commissioner Hale had already moved on to something about the harbor toll disputes, and her father was turning to engage with someone to his left, and for 3 seconds it was only Eleanor and Alexander in the middle of a crowded room. "You look well," he said very quietly, in a tone the alderman couldn't have heard. "Mr. Fairchild," she said at the same volume, "we've only just been introduced." His eyes moved. The corner of his mouth did not. "Of course. Forgive me." Dinner was an exercise in sustained performance that Eleanor found simultaneously exhausting and clarifying. She was seated 4 places from Alexander, on the opposite side of the table, far enough that direct conversation was impossible, close enough that she was aware of him. The way you're aware of a fire in a cold room, by the warmth coming off it without ever looking directly at it. She watched him work the table. It was instructive. He wasn't charming in the effortful way of men who needed to be liked. He simply engaged with whoever was speaking, as though what they were saying mattered, and people responded to that, the way plants respond to actual light versus candlelight. Commissioner Hale was practically leaning toward him by the fish course. The alderman had laughed 3 times. Mrs. Eloise Carver, seated to Alexander's right, was not leaning. Mrs. Carver was 62. And had attended 40 years of Boston dinners, and had a manner of looking at newcomers that could strip paint, and she was directing the full force of it at Alexander with the particular intensity of a woman running a covert assessment. Eleanor watched her, and then watched Alexander, and waited. "You're from Philadelphia, Mr. Fairchild," Mrs. Carver said. "Not a question." "I am, ma'am. Your family made their money in land." "They did. And you're looking to expand your interests northward." A brief pause. "I'm exploring possibilities, yes. Through the Whitman connection." The table didn't quite go quiet, but several conversations nearby dimmed. Eleanor felt her father's hand tighten around his fork from 4 seats away. "Through several connections," Alexander said evenly. "Boston has a great deal to recommend it." Mrs. Carver looked at him the way she looked at everything, like she was turning it over and checking the underside. "And what is it specifically that recommends the Whitman family to a man of your means and position, Mr. Fairchild? Because Harold Whitman is a decent man, but his estate is, shall we say, not what it was." The silence now was definite. Eleanor kept her face neutral and her eyes on her plate, and her heart hammering somewhere in the vicinity of her throat. "Mrs. Carver," Alexander said, and his voice had dropped just slightly, not cold, but final, the way you lower a gate. "I'll answer that plainly since you've asked it plainly. I came to Boston because I'm 31 years old, and I'm tired of going home to a house with no one in it. Harold Whitman's estate and its current conditions are irrelevant to that. His daughter's character is not." He picked up his wine glass. "I hope that's plain enough." The table breathed again. Harold Whitman looked as though he'd been struck by something he hadn't expected to want to cry about. Eleanor looked up from her plate. Alexander was looking at her. Just for a second, one clear, unguarded second, and then he looked away back to Mrs. Carver, who was regarding him now with the expression of a woman who had just upgraded her assessment considerably. "Well," Mrs. Carver said, "that is plain." After dinner, the party moved to the Prescott drawing room, and the men gathered near the brandy, and the women arranged themselves in the conversational clusters that served as the evening's second performance, and Eleanor moved to the window. She stood with her back half turned to the room, and looked out at the lamplight on the street below, and let herself breathe for the first time since they'd arrived. He was beside her in 6 minutes. She knew without turning around. "That was unnecessary," she said quietly. "What you said to Mrs. Carver." "It was true," he said. "It was also—" She stopped, kept her voice low, both of them facing the window, both of them maintaining the posture of two near strangers exchanging pleasantries near the glass. "It was kind, and it complicated things." "How?" "Because now everyone in that room believes you're marrying me out of genuine preference rather than practical arrangement. Which means, if it falls through, the story becomes that I refused a good man rather than that two families renegotiated terms." "Does it fall through?" he said. She turned her head a fraction, not enough to look at him directly. "I don't know yet, Eleanor." His voice was very quiet. "I meant what I said tonight." "I know you did," she said. "That's what I'm trying to think about." A beat. "What is there to think about?" She looked down at the street. A carriage was passing, the sound of the wheels on cobblestones, the same sound that had started all of this 9 days ago, when a horse ran loose and a stranger stepped into its path and the world rearranged itself. "I've spent 9 days knowing you as one thing," she said. "And tonight I watched you be another thing. And they're the same person, which is that's not supposed to happen. Men are one way in drawing rooms and another way in morning streets, and those two things are not supposed to be the same man. And if they are—" She was quiet for a moment. "Then I've run out of reasonable objections," she said, and heard how exposed it sounded and kept going anyway because she was done not saying things. "And the only thing left is the unreasonable ones." "Tell me the unreasonable ones," he said. She turned then fully and looked at him. They were close enough that this was risky, close enough that anyone watching would notice, would read something into it, and she didn't step back. "I'm afraid," she said, "of choosing something because I want it, and finding out later that I only wanted it because I was desperate for one thing in my life that wasn't chosen for me. I'm afraid I can't tell the difference between myself and my circumstances right now. And I'm afraid—" Her voice didn't waver, she made sure. "I'm afraid that you're too good at making me trust you, and I don't know yet if that's because you're trustworthy or because I'm in a situation where I desperately need someone to be." Alexander held her gaze through all of it, didn't interrupt, didn't reassure her too fast, which was the thing that would have undone everything. When she finished, he said, "Those are not unreasonable objections." "I know," she said. "They're also not arguments against the arrangement. They're arguments for taking more time." "We don't have more time. The dinner has happened. My father expects—" "Your father can wait another week." He said it with a quiet certainty that was not unkind toward Harold, but was absolutely not asking his permission. "The debt doesn't come due for 6 weeks. 1 more week changes nothing for him and changes everything for you." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm asking you to stop deciding against it just because you're frightened of deciding for it." Eleanor looked at him. The drawing room moved around them, conversations and crystal and candlelight, and she was standing at a window with a man she'd met 9 days ago, and she had run out of walls to put between them. "1 more week," she said. "1 more week," he agreed. She looked at him for 1 more moment, and then she straightened and turned back to the room and became Eleanor Whitman again, suitable and composed and entirely unreadable. But she was smiling, just slightly, just enough. She found out about the ledger on a Wednesday, not from her father, not from Alexander, from Thomas the houseman, who had the misfortune of carrying a document from her father's study to the post, and the greater misfortune of passing Eleanor in the hallway at the same moment. She recognized her father's handwriting on the outside of the document. She recognized the name of Fairchild's solicitor in Philadelphia as the addressee. And she recognized from 3 years of managing household accounts that the document was too thick to be a letter. "Thomas," she said. Thomas stopped. He'd worked for the Whitmans for 16 years and had the expression of a man who knew he was caught and had decided that honesty was the fastest way out of it. "Miss Eleanor," he said. "What is that?" A pause. "Documents from your father, miss, for posting." "What kind of documents?" Another pause longer. "I believe property documents, miss, related to the Whitman holdings in Concord." Eleanor felt something cold move through her. The Concord holdings were not part of the arrangement as she understood it. The Concord holdings were Clara's inheritance. The one piece of Whitman property her father had always maintained was untouched, separate, protected. "Give it to me," she said. "Miss, your father asked me to—" "Thomas." She held out her hand. He gave her the document. She stood in the hallway and read it, and the cold in her chest spread outward until it reached her hands, which had gone very still around the paper. Her father had not promised only her. He had promised Clara's inheritance as collateral for the portion of the debt that Eleanor's marriage settlement didn't cover. Quietly, without telling either of his daughters. The document was already drafted, already signed on his side, waiting only for Fairchild's solicitor's countersignature to become binding. Eleanor stood very still. She thought about Alexander at dinner, saying his estate and its current conditions are irrelevant. His daughter's character is not. She thought about him saying, "I'm not going to force a woman to stand across from me at an altar." She thought about one more week, and trust, and the difference between a door held open and a door locked shut. And she thought he might not know about this document. Or he might. She thought she had no way to know which. She handed the document back to Thomas. "Post it," she said. Her voice was even. "But Thomas—" She stopped him before he turned away. "Don't mention to my father that I saw it." "Yes, miss," Thomas said, and was gone. Eleanor stood alone in the hallway for a long time. Then she went upstairs, put on her walking shoes, took her shawl, and went out the door. If Alexander Fairchild was at the corner of the Apothecary Street tomorrow morning, she would know which conversation to have with him. And if he wasn't, if 6 mornings had been theater, and tomorrow the theater was over, she would know something else entirely. She had until morning to decide which answer she could survive. He was there. That was the first thing. The only thing for a moment. Just the fact of him standing at the corner of the Apothecary Street in the early morning light with his hat in his hand, and his eyes finding her the second she came around the bend, and Eleanor felt something in her chest release, that she hadn't realized she'd been holding clenched all night. He was there. Which didn't tell her everything, but it told her enough to begin. She walked toward him, and she did not slow her pace, and she did not smile, and she did not give him anything in her expression that wasn't the question she'd come to ask. He read it before she got within 10 feet of him. She could see him read it, the way his posture changed, the way he stopped being a man, waiting, and became a man bracing. "You know," she said. Not an accusation, a test. He didn't pretend not to understand. "About the Concord documents." "Yes." A beat. His jaw moved. "I found out 3 days ago." 3 days ago. Eleanor counted backward. Before the dinner. Before Mrs. Carver and the brandy in the window and 1 more week. He had known about it before all of that, and had said nothing, and had still stood beside her at that window and told her she had a choice. "Tell me what you know," she said. "All of it." He did. He told it plainly, without ornamentation, the way she'd learned he told everything that mattered. His solicitor had flagged the Concord property as appearing in the debt documentation without having been disclosed in the original arrangement terms. His solicitor had queried it. Harold had provided a secondary document already signed, already in transit, adding the Concord holdings as collateral against the portion of the debt not covered by the marriage settlement. "Clara's inheritance," Eleanor said. "Yes?" "He didn't tell me." "No." "Did he tell you?" She watched his face carefully. Or did your solicitor find it? My solicitor found it, he said. Your father presented the original arrangement as complete. This was additional, added after I'd already agreed to the primary terms. Eleanor stood with this for a moment. The morning was warm and already full of city noise, and she was standing on a cobblestone street, running the arithmetic of betrayal in her head. Her father had not simply arranged her marriage. He had also quietly arranged Clara's future as a secondary transaction, without asking either of his daughters, without disclosing it to the man he was arranging it with. He had taken the one thing he'd always said was protected, and used it as a card he thought no one would see. What did you do when your solicitor told you? She asked. Alexander looked at her steadily. I told him not to countersign. The Concord document is sitting unsigned in my solicitor's office in Philadelphia. Eleanor felt the breath go out of her. You blocked it, she said. I declined to proceed with a term I hadn't agreed to and hadn't been disclosed. He kept his eyes on her. Your sister's inheritance is not part of any arrangement I've made or will make. I want that to be very clear. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out with more edge than she'd intended. Raw, a little ragged, the sound of a woman who'd spent a sleepless night in the worst possible version of the story she was now standing outside of. He accepted the edge without deflecting it. Because I was trying to decide, he said, whether it was my place to tell you something about your father that you didn't know. It's not a simple calculation. It's your family. Your father. A pause. I didn't want to be the man who walked into your life and immediately started delivering verdicts about the people in it. But you should have told me, she said. Yes, he said. I should have. I'm sorry I didn't. The apology landed simply without qualification, and Eleanor hated a little how much easier it made the next breath. She walked. He fell into step beside her the way he always did, and for half a block neither of them spoke, and the silence was different from all the previous silences, heavier but not broken. The kind of silence that was actually a conversation happening underneath words. I have to talk to my father, she said. I know. And I have to know before I do that whether the arrangement itself still stands, or whether this changes what you're willing to do. He stopped walking. She stopped a half step later and turned back to him. Eleanor. His voice was quiet and completely certain. The arrangement I made was with you. Whatever your father has added or not added to the ledger, that doesn't change what I said at the window on the 15th. You have a choice. You've always had one. That's not contingent on what Harold Whitman puts in his documents. She looked at him. And the debt is manageable without the Concord property. I told my solicitor that 3 days ago. Then why is the document still? Why was it being posted yesterday if your solicitor hasn't signed? Because your father doesn't know yet that I declined. He held her gaze. My solicitor sent a query. Your father's response was to send the signed document anyway and hope it would be processed without further question. Which tells you something about how your father operates when he's frightened. Eleanor looked at the ground for a moment. It told her something about how her father operated, yes. It told her several things, in fact, none of which were new exactly, but all of which were sharper now than they'd been before. I need to go home, she said. Eleanor. I'm not running, she said, and looked back up at him. I'm going to handle something. That's different. He studied her face. Something in his expression moved worry, she thought, which was its own complicated thing to see on this man's face. Will you tell me how it goes? I'll be here tomorrow morning, she said. She walked away quickly. She had a conversation to have with her father, and she wanted to have it while the anger was still clean and before it could curdle into something less useful. Harold Whitman was in his study with his account books and a cup of coffee when Eleanor opened the door without knocking, stepped inside, closed the door behind her, and put herself between him and the exit. He looked up, read her face, put down his pen. Eleanor, the Concord property, she said. The color left his face in one visible movement like a tide going out. He set his coffee down. He did not say anything immediately, which told her that he had known this conversation was coming and had not yet decided how to have it. "It was a secondary measure," he said finally. "A contingency. It's Clara's inheritance. It's my property too. Mother gave it to Clara." Eleanor's voice was controlled and absolute. "Specifically, in a document that predates every debt you've accumulated. You know that." Harold pressed his hands flat on the desk. "The debt? I know what the debt is, Father. I've known since supper 2 weeks ago, $40,000. And I agreed standing in front of this house to appear at that dinner and conduct myself appropriately, and give this arrangement a genuine chance because I understood what the stakes were for this family." She held his gaze. "I did not agree to let you sell Clara's future as a side transaction without telling either of us. I was trying to protect. You were trying to manage the situation without having to be honest about it." She kept her voice flat. Not cruel, flat. The way you speak when you want someone to hear the shape of a fact without the heat of it. "And Mr. Fairchild's solicitor found it." Harold went very still. "He declined to countersign," Eleanor said. "3 days ago. The document is sitting unsigned in Philadelphia because Alexander Fairchild looked at your terms and decided they weren't the terms he'd agreed to." She watched her father process this. "He didn't tell you." "He told me this morning." Her father was quiet for a long moment. He looked in this moment less like Harold Whitman of Beacon Hill, and more like a tired man who had been making one decision too many for too long and had finally run out of road. "I didn't know what else to do," he said, and his voice had gone to something she'd never heard from him before. Not defensive, just bare. Eleanor looked at him. Part of her, the part that remembered being 10 years old and watching this man carry her mother's grief for a year while still managing to be present for 2 daughters who needed him, felt the pull of that. The complicated love that doesn't go away just because someone has failed you. "You could have told me the truth," she said. "That's what else you could have done." Silence. "I need you to withdraw the Concord document," she said. "Write to your solicitor today and retract it. Clara's inheritance is not part of this." Harold looked at his desk, at his books, at the accumulated evidence of years of decisions made in private that had brought him to this particular morning. "All right," he said quietly. "And I need you to stop managing this like I'm a piece on a board," Eleanor said. "Whatever happens with Mr. Fairchild, however this ends, I am making that decision, not you. If I marry him, it's because I chose to. And if I don't, you find another way to handle the debt. Those are the terms." Her father looked up at her. His eyes were red at the edges. "He knows about the Concord situation, and he didn't walk away. He protected Clara's inheritance before he'd even spoken to you about it," Eleanor said. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said very slowly, "What kind of man does that—" "A good one," Eleanor said. "Which is something you should have let me discover myself, instead of arranging me into the vicinity of it, and hoping I wouldn't look too closely at the mechanism." She turned and walked out. She didn't slam the door. She closed it quietly, which felt more final. Clara was in the hallway. Of course she was. "I heard," Clara said. "I know. All of it. Probably." Clara looked at her with those dark eyes that were so like their mother's and said very quietly, "He protected me. Mr. Fairchild. He didn't have to do that." "No," Eleanor agreed. "He didn't." "Eleanor." Clara grabbed her arm before she could walk past. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor looked at her sister, 16 years old. Dark eyes. The one person in this house who had always known the difference between Eleanor performing composure and Eleanor actually meaning it. "I'm going to figure out," Eleanor said, "whether I'm brave enough to want something because I want it, not because it's practical, not because Father arranged it, not because the circumstances made it the obvious choice." She paused. "Just because I want it." Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she said with the particular gentle directness of a younger sister who has been watching her older sister fight everything for 23 years. "Eleanor, you've wanted it since the second morning." Eleanor opened her mouth, closed it. Go to sleep, Clara said. You look terrible. And then tomorrow morning go to that street corner and stop pretending you're still deciding. She went to the street corner. He was there hat in hand exactly as he'd been every morning for 10 days, and when she came around the bend, he looked at her the way he always looked at her, that plain, direct, complete attention, and she walked up to him and stopped and said, I spoke to my father. How did it go? He's withdrawing the Concord document. Something in Alexander's face settled. Good. And I told him that whatever decision I make about this arrangement, it's mine, not his. She held his gaze. He agreed. Alexander nodded. Also good. And She stopped, breathed. Clara's voice in her head, you've wanted it since the second morning. I want to stop pretending I'm approaching this rationally. Because I'm not. I haven't been for days, and we both know it, and I'm tired of maintaining the pretense that I'm conducting a sensible assessment when what I'm actually doing is scared, he said. Yes. The word came out small and honest, and she kept going before she could take it back. I'm scared of choosing something that feels this consequential, that feels this real. Because when things feel this real and they go wrong, you don't recover the same way. He looked at her for a long, careful moment. Eleanor, he said, I stepped in front of a horse for a stranger. She looked at him. I'm telling you that because I need you to understand I don't do things halfway. I don't engage with something and then walk away from it because it got complicated. If I'm in, I'm in. He held her gaze. And I have been in since a woman on a street corner told me her name was Rose and looked at me like she dared me to believe her. Eleanor's chest did something large and complicated. That's not reassurance, she said, and her voice was a little unsteady, and she didn't try to fix it. That's the most frightening thing you've said to me. I know, he said. I mean it anyway. She looked at him. This man, this entirely unexpected, road-dusty, horse-stopping, Clara's inheritance protecting, one more week man. This person she had not planned for and could not now imagine the coming months without which was its own specific kind of terrifying. I want to say yes, she said. To the arrangement. To, she stopped. To more than the arrangement. He waited. But I need one thing first, she said. Name it. I need to know that Eleanor and Rose get to be the same person, she said. That I don't have to put one away to be the other, that you want... She stopped again. That you want all of it, not the suitable temperament version, not the Morning Street version, the whole thing, the stubbornness and the account books and the direct questions and the days when I'm not... She exhaled. The days when I'm not easy to be around. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression she'd never quite seen from him before. Open, unguarded, the face of a man who had stopped managing how he looked. Eleanor, he said quietly. Rose. Whichever name you're standing in right now. He took one step toward her. I've been wanting all of it since Thursday. She breathed. Okay, she said. Quiet. Real. No performance anywhere in it. Okay, he said. They stood on the cobblestone street in the July morning, the city moving around them indifferent and ordinary, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Eleanor Whitman was not managing anything at all. But somewhere behind the relief, a thought was forming, small and cold and precise. Her father had hidden the Concord document. Alexander's solicitor had found it. But her father's accounts, the ones Eleanor had been managing for 3 years, had other numbers in them. Numbers she'd been too close to question. Numbers that had always seemed like ordinary losses. Investments gone quiet. Payments to unnamed creditors, small, consistent outflows that she'd recorded faithfully without ever asking where they were going. She had not asked because she'd trusted. Standing in the morning warmth with the first real thing she'd chosen, pressing against her chest, Eleanor Whitman began very quietly to wonder what else she hadn't looked at closely enough, and whether whatever it was would survive the light. She didn't go back inside right away. After Alexander walked her to the end of the block and tipped his hat and said he'd see her tomorrow. Eleanor turned toward home and slowed her pace deliberately and let the thought she'd pushed down settle fully into her chest, where she could look at it properly. 3 years of household accounts. 3 years of numbers she'd entered faithfully, receipts and expenditures and investment returns and creditor payments. And she had been proud of that work, genuinely proud, because it was the one area where her father had let her be useful in a way that was real. She'd caught 2 errors in the old bookkeeper's final ledgers. She'd renegotiated the household supplier contracts and saved $400 in the first year alone. But she had never questioned where the outflows were going. She had recorded the amounts and the dates and the general category: creditor settlement, investment loss, estate management. And she had not looked behind the categories because her father had given her the books as a gift of trust, and she had treated it as one. The question was whether that trust had been warranted. She went straight to the study when she got home. Her father was not there. She sat down at his desk, opened the household ledger to 18 months prior, and began to read backward. It took her 4 hours. By the time Clara knocked on the study door and said supper was ready, Eleanor had filled 6 pages of her own notepaper with figures and cross-references and 3 columns of numbers that did not reconcile with each other no matter how many times she ran them. Eleanor. Clara opened the door, saw her face, and stopped. "What's wrong?" "Close the door," Eleanor said. Clara closed it and came to the desk and looked at the papers. She was 16 and had not spent 3 years with the household accounts, but she was their mother's daughter, and she could read a room, and she read this one. "How bad?" she asked quietly. "I don't know yet," Eleanor said. "But there are payments here, regular ones, every 6 to 8 weeks for the past 2 years, going to a listing that says Hartwell Estate Management. No address, no corresponding service that I can identify, no receipts filed." She looked up. "The total is $11,000. Clara sat down slowly. "What is Hartwell?" "I don't know, but it's not one of our suppliers. It's not a creditor I've ever had correspondence with. And it predates the debt crisis by 14 months, which means—" Eleanor stopped, started again. "Which means whatever this is, it isn't a consequence of Father's financial trouble. It may be the cause of part of it." "Or someone is taking money from him," Clara said. "Or he's paying someone to keep quiet about something," Eleanor said, and the words landed in the room like stones dropped in cold water, and both sisters sat with the sound they made. She did not sleep that night. She lay in bed and ran the numbers in her head and thought about what she knew and what she didn't, and what the difference between those 2 things might cost. By 4 in the morning, she had made a decision. By 7, she was at the Apothecary Street corner, and this time she was there before Alexander, and she was waiting when he came around the bend and saw her and read her face in one look. "Tell me," he said before she could speak. She told him. All of it, the accounts, the Hartwell payments, the $11,000 over 2 years, the absence of any corresponding documentation. She told it fast and flat, the way you tell things when you need someone to understand facts before they respond with feelings. When she finished, he was quiet for exactly the length of time it took him to process it, rather than react to it, which she had learned was his particular quality. "Hartwell," he said. "You know it. I know a Hartwell." He said it carefully. "There's a land speculator in western Massachusetts, Edmund Hartwell. He operates in distressed estate situations. He identifies properties with debt pressure, and he—" He stopped. "He what?" Eleanor said. "He purchases the debt from the original creditors and then applies it as leverage to force property sales at reduced value. He's been investigated twice in Philadelphia for deed fraud. Never convicted." He looked at her. "If your father has been paying him for 2 years, it might mean Hartwell got to the debt before I did. Which means your father might not have been paying me as freely as I thought he might have been paying Hartwell first. And the residual is what reached my solicitor." Eleanor felt the calculation rearrange itself in her head. "Which means the 40,000 might not be the real number," Alexander said. "Hartwell takes a percentage off the top, always. If he's been in this for 2 years and your father has been paying him $11,000 in what management fees, that's an access fee. for keeping Hartwell from calling the full debt due at once. His jaw tightened. "Your father isn't just in debt, Eleanor. He's been paying a man to hold other men back from his door, like renting time." She stood in the morning heat and felt the full shape of it assemble in front of her. Her father had not simply made bad investments. He had made bad investments. Lost ground, found Hartwell, and then spent 2 years making quiet payments to buy himself space to breathe, while the actual debt grew underneath. And then, Fairchild's name had appeared a legitimate creditor with legitimate means, and Harold had pivoted to the marriage arrangement as a way to clear the visible debt without ever disclosing that Hartwell existed. "He doesn't know you know about Hartwell," Eleanor said. "No," Alexander said, "and Hartwell doesn't know I know about him." "If Hartwell finds out the Whitman debt is being settled by a Fairchild arrangement, what does he do?" Alexander looked at her steadily. "He calls the remainder due immediately, or he exposes whatever he's been holding over your father as a reason to keep paying, whichever hurts more." "What is he holding?" Eleanor said, "because $11,000 in management fees over 2 years isn't just buying silence about debt. That's buying silence about something else." Alexander held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "it is." She went back to the ledger. This time she wasn't looking for outflows. She was looking for the period 14 months before the Hartwell payments started. She was looking for the thing that had made her father willing to pay a man like Edmund Hartwell $11,000 in hush money over the course of 2 years. She found it in the investment records from the winter of 1811. Her father had put $30,000 into a land venture in Western Virginia, a mining speculation on paper. The return had been projected at triple the investment within 18 months. The money had gone out. No returns had ever come in. And the venture's operating name filed in the investment documentation in her father's careful handwriting was listed as a joint enterprise between Harold Whitman and one other principal. The other principal's name was Edmund Hartwell. Eleanor sat back in her chair and understood. Her father had not been victimized by Hartwell. He had been in business with him. He had invested $30,000 in a joint land speculation the venture had failed or been fraudulent from the beginning. And when the loss became undeniable, Hartwell had flipped position from partner to creditor, from associate to leverage, and Harold had been paying him ever since to keep his involvement in a failed speculation quiet. Because if the speculation had been fraudulent and Harold had been a principal, his exposure wasn't just financial, it was legal. She sat with that for a long time. Then she closed the ledger, put her notepaper in the pocket of her dress, and went to find Alexander. He came to the house this time. She'd sent Thomas with a note. "Can you come to Beacon Hill at 2 o'clock? It's important." And he arrived at 1:58, which she noted, and Thomas showed him to the sitting room, and Eleanor came in and closed the door. "I found it," she said. She put the notepaper on the table between them and walked him through it. He listened without interrupting. His face went through several things. Comprehension, anger, something harder, and he controlled all of them except the jaw, which was doing something steady and tight. "He was Hartwell's partner," Alexander said when she finished. "Yes." "Which means the original speculation was either incompetent or fraudulent," Eleanor said. "I can't tell which from the documents I have, but Hartwell's criminal history in Philadelphia suggests he doesn't enter ventures intending them to succeed. He enters them intending to fail strategically," Alexander said. "Take the investment, declare a loss, leverage the partner's involvement to extract ongoing payments." He looked at her. "Your father lost $30,000 in the speculation and has been paying $11,000 more to keep Hartwell from telling anyone he was involved, which is why the $40,000 figure exists. It's not all investment loss, part of it is the cost of the secret." "Yes," Eleanor said. "And Hartwell knows that if this marriage arrangement goes through and I clear the visible debt, his leverage over your father disappears. So when he finds out, he'll move," Eleanor said, "to expose whatever he has before the arrangement closes." They looked at each other across the sitting room table. 17 days since a horse ran loose on a cobblestone street. 17 days, and they were sitting across a table built from her father's secrets, and the thing Eleanor had been afraid of. The thing she'd told him about at the window. About choosing something real and watching it go wrong was sitting right here between them with teeth. "This changes things," she said. Not a question. "Yes," he said. Her heart did something cold. "For you?" "For the arrangement as it stands." He met her eyes. "Not for—" He stopped, breathed. "Not for the other thing." She looked at him. "Alexander, my father may have been party to a fraudulent scheme. If Hartwell exposes it—" "I know." "The Whitman name—" "I know Eleanor." "It could be—" "I know." He said it quietly and with complete finality, and then leaned forward with his elbows on the table and looked at her directly. "I'm not walking away because your father made a catastrophic mistake 17 years ago with a man who was probably running a con from the beginning. I'm not. I came here for you. Not for the Whitman estate. Not for the clean transaction. For you." He held her gaze. "But I need to know, do you want to fix this? Or do you want to let it run and see what Hartwell does?" Eleanor thought about Clara, about Beacon Hill, about her mother's pearl earrings and the account books she'd managed for 3 years, and her father's red-rimmed eyes saying, "I didn't know what else to do." "I want to fix it," she said. "Then we do it together," he said. "And it starts with your father." Harold Whitman looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. Eleanor noticed it the way you notice something you'd been avoiding, the specific exhaustion of a man who has been keeping secrets for a very long time and knows somewhere in his bones that the keeping is almost over. Eleanor sat across from him and put the notepaper on the desk between them and let him look at it. She watched his face go through everything. Recognition. Shame, the particular collapse of a man whose careful architecture has finally given way, and she did not fill the silence because the silence was necessary. Some things had to be felt fully before they could be moved past. He put his face in his hands. "How long have you known?" he asked into his palms. "Since this morning," she said. He looked up. His eyes were red. "Eleanor, don't." She kept her voice even, not cruel, even. "Don't apologize yet. Just tell me what Hartwell has, what documentation, what he's threatening to show." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said slowly, "Letters from the early speculation, in my handwriting outlining the venture terms. He says he has 6 of them. He says if the Fairchild arrangement proceeds and his fee stops—" He stopped, exhaled. "He says he'll take them to the county commissioner, position them as evidence that I was party to deliberate fraud against the venture's other investors." "Were you?" Eleanor said. Deliberately. Harold looked at his daughter. "No," he said, and she believed him, not because she wanted to, but because she could read him, had always been able to read him, even when she'd preferred not to. "I believed it was legitimate. When it started failing, I went to Hartwell, and he changed, became someone else, started talking about my exposure. I panicked." He closed his eyes. "I paid him because I panicked." "Okay," Eleanor said. "Okay." His voice cracked slightly on the word. "I'm not forgiving it tonight," she said. "But I understand it. And I need you to understand something." She held his gaze. "Mr. Fairchild knows. He's known since this morning, and he's still here." Harold stared at her. "He is in the sitting room," Eleanor said. "And we have a plan. But it requires you to do something you have not done once in the past 2 years. She paused. "Tell the truth. To the right person before Hartwell gets to tell his version." Her father looked at the door, at the notepaper, at his daughter. "What person?" he said. "Commissioner Hale," Eleanor said, "who you sat across from at dinner 9 days ago and who I happen to know has been building a case against Hartwell's land speculation practices for 14 months and has been looking for a credible witness." She met his father's eyes. "You can be the man who comes forward. or you can be the man Hartwell exposes. Those are the two options. But the first one has a future in it, and the second one doesn't. Harold Whitman looked at his eldest daughter for a long, full moment. "How do you know about Hale's investigation?" he said. "Alexander told me this morning." A pause. "He looked into it the same day his solicitor found the Concord document. He's been trying to understand the full picture." She held her father's gaze. "He does that. He doesn't do things halfway." Her father was quiet. Then he said very quietly, "He's a good man." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He is. And he came to Boston looking for something real. So did I. And I am not going to let Edmund Hartwell take it, because you were too frightened to tell the truth 2 years ago." She stood. "Come to the sitting room, Father. It's time." The meeting with Commissioner Hale was arranged for the following morning. Alexander's solicitor came up from Philadelphia on the overnight coach and arrived at 7 with a briefcase of documentation and the particular brisk competence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Hale came at 9 with 2 deputies and the expression of a man who had been waiting 14 months for something precisely like this to land in his office. Harold Whitman told the truth. All of it. Eleanor sat beside him, and Alexander sat across the room and said nothing, because this was not his moment to carry. It was Harold's, and Harold to his credit carried it without flinching. Hale listened. His deputies took notes. When Harold finished, Hale was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Mr. Whitman, the letters Hartwell has, can you describe their content with specificity?" Harold could. He did. Hale nodded once. "Those letters do not constitute fraud on your part. They constitute fraud on Hartwell's. His representation of the venture to you was as fraudulent as his representation of it to the other investors. You were a victim who was subsequently leveraged into becoming a source of operating income." He looked at Harold steadily. "Your cooperation will be reflected in our handling of the matter." Harold pressed his hands flat on the table. "And the payments I've made will be addressed in the settlement process." Hale glanced at Alexander. "With Mr. Fairchild's involvement noted as that of a legitimate creditor acting in good faith." He closed his notebook. "We'll move on Hartwell within the week." After Hale and his deputies were gone, and Harold had gone upstairs, and the solicitor had packed his briefcase and departed, Eleanor stood in the front hallway with Alexander and breathed for the first time in what felt like days. "It's over," she said. "The Hartwell part is," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that expression, the open, unguarded one she'd only seen a handful of times, the one that meant he'd stopped managing how he looked. "The rest of it," he said quietly, "is just beginning." Eleanor looked at this man. This specific, impossible, entirely unplanned man who had stepped in front of a horse on a Tuesday and handed her a peach on a Thursday and sat across a table full of her family's wreckage and said together like it was the most obvious word in the world. She thought about Rose, that name she'd given herself on a street corner, the woman who owed nothing to anyone. She understood now that Rose had never been a different person. Rose was just Eleanor without the weight. And Eleanor, it turned out, didn't have to carry the weight alone. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his face, almost a smile almost, and then something warmer and more serious underneath it. He didn't go down on a knee. He wasn't that kind of man, and she wasn't that kind of woman, and they both knew it. He simply turned to face her fully and said, plain as anything, the way he said everything that mattered, "Eleanor Whitman, will you marry me? Not the arrangement me. Whatever comes after this, the good parts and the hard parts and the account books and the mornings and all the rest of it." She looked at him for exactly as long as it took to be certain, not performing certainty, but feeling it, the real kind that settles in the chest, like something finding its proper weight. "Yes," she said, "all of it. Yes." He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with flourish, just took it. Her hand in his, warm and steady and completely real, and she held on, and that was enough. That was everything. 3 weeks later, on a bright August morning in Boston's Old South Church, with Clara weeping happily in the front pew, and Commissioner Hale in the third row, and Thomas standing straight-backed near the door, and Harold Whitman giving away his daughter with the careful dignity of a man who understood exactly what he was being trusted with. Eleanor Whitman became Eleanor Fairchild. She walked out of that church into the August light with her hand in Alexander's and her mother's pearl earrings in her ears, and her own name, her whole complete, uncompromised name fully in place at last. She had started this summer as a letter under a bedroom door, a transaction, a suitable temperament to be arranged. She ended it as a woman who had chosen fully and freely with both eyes open and both hands steady. And the man beside her had been worth every single frightening step of the choosing. That was not the end of the story. But it was the beginning of the right one, and Eleanor Fairchild walked into it without looking back.